Accessibility in games is a good thing. It's a statement that few would find to be obtuse or outlandish in nature. Accessibility has come a long way in recent years, as pressure from within the industry to expand to more audiences becomes increasingly prevalent, and the necessity to reach more players larger than ever. The gaming landscape has been familiar with the concept of accessibility options for decades now. Text-based adventure games such as Zork, Planetfall, and The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, all having adjustable text and color options, enabled players to tailor the experience to their own needs even back then. This style of customizable settings was for a long time the norm for a lot of video games, with games such as Mortal Kombat and Doom following suit with their button remapping. It was only in the early 2000s that video games would begin to change entire aspects of gameplay to accommodate for different playstyles and ability levels. The most famous example of varying difficulties from the time was Halo Combat Evolved's various difficulty options, ranging from easy to legendary and having a plethora of collectible skulls, which would allow you to customize the game even further. This trend of video game difficulty being the means through which games became more accessible would continue. That's not to say, however, that this didn't have its downsides, such as Wolfenstein's New Order's Don't Hurt Me Daddy setting, and Metal Gear Solid 5 Chicken Hat being a forced equipable item if you pick the easiest mode, caused frustration to players who through real-world issues are forced to pick these easier options. This mocking nature would be harmful to those not able to play games and requiring a lower difficulty. However, this doesn't mean that as we move forward, accessibility options got worse. In 2018, Xbox released their adaptive controllers, allowing users to customize their gamepad to allow people to play regardless of their physical capabilities, and as a result saw abundant praise from various people within the disabled community. Around the same time, although about a year prior, Mario Kart 8 Deluxe released on the Nintendo Switch, with a solid approach to tackling the topic of accessibility. The game has two unique accessibility options, Smart Steering and Auto Accelerate. On paper, these abilities sound incredibly powerful, and could essentially make the gameplay itself, as some people proved it could do so. However, when using these options, the game locks you out of certain other abilities which would close the gap in high level play, notably the level 3 boost. With this option equipped, the game won't give you access to the third and final boost level while drifting, potentially locking the player out of achieving top speeds. This change, while subtle, is enough to prevent this option from being abusable by higher skilled players. With all this said then, we can clearly see the growth accessibility in games has made over time, and how there are plenty of good ways to make a game accessible without impacting the experience of other players negatively, and also creating a fair and balanced environment. To go back to that original statement then, I think it's easy to say that accessibility in games is a good thing, and that it is more than achievable to implement it efficiently. Or is it? See, all these previous examples worked because the games in question were either single player or had a casual multiplayer where the balancing wouldn't cause too much upset. When we move into games where the competitive nature of them is what makes not only the game, but the genre in and of itself, it's hard to avoid running into issues when coming up with accessibility options in a game. One genre which has always struggled with fair implementation of accessible entry is the fighting game genre. Fighting games as we know them today are essentially an evolution of the concepts introduced in the original Street Fighter II, and are known for a few things. They are 1v1 games focused around making combos and holding your ground, with the first person to reduce their opponent's health to 0 being declared the winner. But they're also renowned for their use of motion inputs. Motion inputs are hard to pick up, not only because they require very fast and coordinated hand movements in fractions of a second, but also because fighting game inputs are really only applicable within the genre of fighting games. See, if you learn to aim well in a game like Halo, that skill transfers to all sorts of other genres as well. But in a game like Guilty Gear, learning how to do a motion input is really only applicable to games in that same genre. An immediate solution to this problem, and an approach games have taken in the past, is to remove motion inputs entirely and instead resort to using what is known as simple inputs, removing technical inputs in favor of using simple directional inputs for their attacks. This works on paper, but in practice runs into a few major issues. Firstly is that a lot of the information available on balancing fighting games is based on the premise that certain attacks require harder inputs. The most famous example of this is Ryu and Ken's Shoryuken Shoryuken input. The Shoryuken/Dragon Punch is an incredibly strong move that is invincible on startup, deals hefty damage, and catches the opponent if they try to jump in. The game balances this by making the input force you out of a defensive option. See, in most fighting games, to block you have to hold the stick backwards, meaning that out of the 9 directional inputs available to you, only 2 are defensive. In order to do a Shoryuken, the player needs to input 3 directions and a punch button, none of which overlap with a blocking button, forcing the player to commit to a risky decision, but if it lands, the player gets a massive reward. If we take this and simply apply the previously mentioned simple inputs, the command for Shoryuken instead looks like this. With the Shoryuken/Dragon Punch being so ingrained into the core of fighting game balance, it's hard to ignore it, and if this input is allowed easy access, then it becomes incredibly unfair to a player who tries to jump in, since it mitigates half of the original inputs, and makes this move especially unfair to those who have already learned the old inputs. That's not to say implementing simple inputs is impossible, however. One example of a game which accomplishes simple inputs very well is Granblue Fantasy Versus. Released in 2020, Granblue Versus had a rough launch. However, the game did do something interesting and placed all these special moves on a cooldown. The cooldown would be longer if done using a simple input, and a lot shorter if using a classic one. This minor change allowed higher level players the advantage they needed, and incentivized using more challenging traditional inputs. However, it didn't lock out people who couldn't do them, instead offering them a solid chance to win without trivializing the game balance afforded by the said traditional inputs. Another game which was highly praised for its accessibility options was Street Fighter VI. Street Fighter VI offers 2 different control options, called Classic and Modern controls. Modern controls offer simpler inputs than the classic control mode allows, in exchange for a slight damage reduction and a slightly smaller move pool for you to choose from. This slight addition to Street Fighter VI gave the game an incredible launch, having the most successful launch of a fighting game since Smash Bros. Ultimate, and being one of the most streamed games on Twitch at its launch, still maintaining relatively top spot even a year later, which is incredible for a fighting game. Street Fighter VI accessibility controls aren't just a gimmick either, and we can see tangible proof of them allowing people to play effectively. Just last year, a completely blind man won a set on EVO main stage, which is an incredibly impressive feat even without the physical disability. Needless to say then, that while fighting game controls are hard to get into, and especially so for someone who is less able to perform certain hand actions, the genre is slowly improving. Which leads to the question, what does the future look like for accessibility in the fighting game community, and general competitive gaming as well? Competitive gaming still has a long way to go in many capacities within the topic of accessibility, and is certainly not at the point casual and single-player games are at with player freedom and accessibility. But that's not to say it's not improving. Fighting games are now being built from the ground up with simple inputs in mind. The recent DNF Duel and the highly anticipated 2XKO are both incredible examples of this. And even though the latter isn't out yet, tech demos have shown incredibly high praise for its intuitive gameplay and simple control scheme. Hardware is beginning to catch up too, with more and more tournaments allowing the use of stickless hitboxes and games being balanced around them to accommodate them fairly. A few years ago, the opinion on hitboxes was wildly different and feels alien to today's landscape. Even beyond just fighting games, other competitive games are implementing accessibility options as well, such as Fortnite's visual sound effects, allowing hard of hearing people to enjoy the same game others do. Gaming has often been a hobby with harder entry points depending on where you choose to look. Hard games are often seen as something to strive for, to create something to push your players and keep them engaged, but that may soon change. Video games are the highest grossing entertainment medium internationally, meaning that they have never had a broader reach. With more and more people wanting to play games than ever before, accessibility now has to be more than simply an afterthought. Accessibility needs to be planned out from as early as possible in a game's development. And so, to once again return back to my opening statement, accessibility in games is a good thing. I think I can rephrase that statement to better fit the current landscape. Accessibility in games is a good thing, when implemented correctly. While we have made incredible strides in recent years, to claim that gaming as a medium is fully accessible is an understatement. and implementing these accessibility options is no easy task in multiplayer games. However, we are making progress. Gaming has a wider reach than it ever has before, and that is in part to how accessible gaming has become. Certain games do need improvements, but in time we will get there, and a truly accessible gaming experience is not only possible, but a lot closer than most realize.